Welcome to the SOAS Dev Track podcast series. The Dev Track podcast series offers episodes covering critical conversations in international development with academics, researchers, and practitioners.
So congratulations on the book, China for Africa's Industrialization.
Question mark.
Sorry?
You. Question mark at the
Question
end.
mark, indeed. I was going to ask you about that because you didn't go for China and Africa's industrialization. You went for China for Africa's industrialization, which is a particular thing.
Yeah.
So tell us why.
So there's two reasons. The for is essentially because the book is about China's contributions to Africa's industrialization efforts, primarily in the last 2 decades, two and a half decades. So it's trying to answer the question as to what these contributions have been and whether the contributions have been sufficiently strong to actually put some African countries on the road towards industrialization. And yeah, the question mark is because I thought, well, it is a question mark. It is a question that has been asked. It has been asked for some time now. And there isn't a clear answer yet. It really depends a lot on the perspective that you take. It does depend also on the context that you look at. It also, I think it's a way of reminding people that Africa is not a country. So, yeah. So, variation is incredibly important to understand. Of course, there are some important commonalities affecting African countries in their pursuit of industrialization, but by and large, what we observe is quite a lot of variation. And in fact, what the book tries is to explore that variation, its drivers, the consequences, and the policy implications, after all.
So it's actually got a really quite a large scope for such a small book. It's a very punchy book. But you've got 25 years of, industrialization or industrial history, if you like. Mm-hmm. And also a lot of countries are discussed, but you focus in particular on Ethiopia and Angola, where you've done quite a lot of primary research data collection. Why don't you tell us about that background research a bit?
Yeah. So I have been following this field for many years now. I think I started before 2010, reading about growing Chinese engagements in Africa. I was, before 2010, there were a lot of question marks back then. And I was very interested in the kind of more primary research that people like Deborah Brautigam used to do at the time. A lot of the emphasis or the focus was on development aid and Chinese aid and what it meant for Africa and so on. Anyway, so going forward, I did observe a number of claims that were made around that time about the employment implications of Chinese engagement in Africa. And a lot of those claims tended to be rather negative or paint a very sort of caricaturesque image of these relations and the consequence of these relations. So that was, in a sense, the entry point for my intervention as an academic, but also primarily my empirical intervention. As you know, I have been working on labor issues in African countries, in several African countries for a long time, now more than, I would say 30 years since I started really doing surveys and looking at African labor markets in very, very different contexts and, from agriculture, to other sectors. So I thought this was a great opportunity. This was a popular type of debate. It was an important question because it was something that wasn't really being addressed in the literature. What are the employment implications of these growing engagements? And frankly, the kinds of claims that abounded around that time were terrible, really, really not founded on any empirical basis, all very anecdotal and So I thought, I could use my expertise in the field and also my interest in China's engagement in Africa, to combine both and then see what we find. Yeah. So that's how it started.
Mhm.
And of course, the focus of the research at that time was on two sectors which were particularly important for anyone who's interested in Chinese engagements in African countries. So obviously construction, and particularly the construction of infrastructure, but also industrial investments, manufacturing investments. And both are connected in a sense that this is one of the points that I make in the book, that looking at infrastructure doesn't mean that you're not really talking about industrialization. Infrastructure, especially economic infrastructure, is absolutely central to industrial efforts. So in a nutshell, by looking at first doing quite an ambitious and deep in scope project on labor issues in Chinese firms in Africa, I sort of venture more broadly into these broader questions on, okay, what does it mean for Africa's industrialization efforts beyond labor? What is it that, because we in the course of that research, which lasted almost 4 years, we did a lot of primary research, a lot of field work, which also consisted of loads and lots of interviews with company managers, with government officials, with representatives of international organizations, with workers themselves, labor organizations. So a lot of these questions and issues came in those interviews all the time. This industrial moment in Ethiopia, for example, and what it means for workers, for managers, for foreign investors, for government. So we basically ventured into questions way beyond employment issues. And in a sense, that's how this book sort of was born, out of that
Yeah.
systematic empirical engagement with these questions. And of course, also, continuous engagement and follow-up of the literature on Africa's industrialization over the last 10, 15 years has expanded a lot, but also increasingly more and more studies looking into these connections. So the combination of these two things allowed for this book. Yeah.
Great, yeah. I mean, I think I found a lot of my assumptions about China's role in industrialization challenge, definitely. There's one assumption being that Chinese firms basically employ Chinese workers, and that doesn't seem to be the case, or unevenly so.
No.
But also the sort of labor regimes, I think, in use, which you talk a lot about, is definitely very, very powerful on the labor side of issues, but also on the kind of how to put it, the foreign policy dimensions, the development policy dimensions. So this phrase of global China you use quite a lot. So the book is very much about global China and its engagements in Africa. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that and how that comes out?
Well, look, I mean, global China is a term that has been coined relatively recently. It has become a field, and in fact, the series for where this element was published is called Global China, and it's led by Qingquan Li, who's a very well-known scholar. And then since Qingquan Li and others are the ones who coined this particular term. So what they mean by that, by global China, is basically they combine three different separate aspects. One is looking at global China as a policy framework, understanding this going out policy. What are the drivers? What are the consequences for other parts of the world, not just Africa? It is also framed as a sort of power project. China as a sort of emerging power and clearly engaging in relations with other parts of the global South in a way that is different from previous engagements. And the third dimension is as a method of analysis. And that's interesting as well, because it looks at, not looking at China on its own, but China as both part and protagonist of capitalist globalization in the last 3 decades or so. So global China is really not just about how China is globalizing and going out, but also the place of China in global economic and political dynamics of the last 3-4 decades. So that's in a sense quite interesting. But as you can see, I actually didn't use the term global China in the title. I could have used it because I thought that my focus was really more about on Africa's industrialization. So I wanted to have Africa more at the center.
Mhm.
And if you start talking about global China, it looks like, well, really your interest is in global China and not so much what's happening. And so I thought, well, actually, it's fair to say, what's China, Africa's industrialization, and frame it around this growing literature on global China.
And then you also avoid the usual methodological nationalism, which
Absolutely.
so destroys so much, I think, globalization analysis. I like the idea of global China as a method analysis. That's particularly attractive, I think. But this whole field, I think, in this moment, in this last year, we've seen the decimation really of Western aid.
Mm-hmm.
Withdrawal also, at least from ideologies, if not yet fully, of practices of free trade, globalization, and so on. So this book comes at a very particular moment.
Yeah.
How does it, when you wrote it, presumably Donald Trump wasn't yet in power. We didn't have America first.
Yeah.
Not quite so fully in position. There were no new tariffs.
Yes.
So how, now you look at this book, what, how does it feel different?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, because clearly one could argue that now there's a counterbalance, there's an alternative. And I think in a sense, of the last 10, 20 years, you've seen a growing aspiration among some African elites and African governments to, as much as possible, delink from traditional partners, at least to diversify. And this kind of strategic triangulation, which was common during the Cold War, has been reignited in the last, since the emergence of China as a major player on the African continent. So that, in a sense, can give a bit of leverage to African governments if they want to use it, not only to find alternative sources of finance for the kinds of things that they want to get funding for, but also potentially to discipline these other traditional donors. But the other point I would make is
wait, don't stop there.
Okay.
Talk a bit more about this disciplining of traditional aid donors. I think
so. In a sense, take the World Bank. Yeah. So the World Bank is an interesting case because what is the World Bank? The World Bank is a development bank. If you think about the remit and I would say the imperative of the World Bank would be to finance hardcore infrastructure. That's why it's there. In fact, for example, if you take the African Development Bank, actually really tries to do that. So, and interestingly, the World Bank has been, particularly within the African context, has been systematically moving away from that pretty much since the 1970s. Okay, it's moving away from production center type of funding, from economic infrastructure type of funding. That used to be the core, the highest percentage of funding from the World Bank used to go to these big things. And they've moved away systematically and into our days. Now, what we find is that potentially the emergence of these alternative development finance sources, China is certainly a big one, but there's also others, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and what have you. If they go towards these uses, the World Bank can see this as a sort of signal that, well, maybe they should change and sort of go gradually back into their core business. So I think there is a little bit of evidence of that happening, although still early days. And that's why I'm saying, having this leverage and these alternative sources of funding may also have this indirect positive impact in terms of bringing traditional donors back into the kind of basics, what I would call the basics for economic infrastructure and the sort of roads and ports and what you need for industrialization. Yeah. And that's why I was saying the fact that aid is in crisis now, that is the budgets are being depleted over the last few years. Well, look, they were already depleted previously for these particular uses. Yeah. One argue that I'm fully aware that this current crisis will have incredibly detrimental effects on things like health or programs for education. So all the kind of social type of infrastructure will be severely affected, particularly in African countries. But the reality is that in the height of aid in the late 90s with the HIPIC initiative or the 2000s, not much money was actually going to roads, ports, hydropower dams, and all these things. Pretty much nothing. Let alone industrial parks or financing industrial investments. Very, very few traditional Western donors were interested in funding these things. So China, in a sense, changed the game somewhat, and despite the fact that it wasn't, when you look at it in aggregate terms, and I point this out in the book, it's not a massive player. Yes, in some countries, you could say China became one of the top bilateral sources of development finance. Not even, I wouldn't even call it aid, just focus on development finance.
Yeah.
But overall, in aggregate, if you think, does it compete with the aggregate of OECD donors? Not really. It's really quite low compared to all those. But yet, it did provide this leverage. It did provide an alternative. So if countries like Ethiopia wanted to finance, large dams or rehabilitation of big road network or a port or railway, they could count on Chinese policy banks to do that, which is something they couldn't do before. So it did make a difference.
Yeah, that really does make a difference. There's that famous quotation, isn't there? When we went to the Westerners for aid, we got a lecture. Maybe the Chinese, we got a hospital.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not. That's an accurate quote, but yeah, that does really change the power dynamics, doesn't it? Significantly. And you use this phrase patient capital.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the World Bank withdrawing for reasons that are not entirely clear,
so
from infrastructure. So tell us about patient capital. You really stress that. That's like really crucial.
Well, I stress that, and maybe I have to eat my words because Chinese policy banks are somewhat withdrawing from that patient capital, at least not giving as much as they used to. Anyway, it's why is it important? If you think about industrialization in any country, in Africa and elsewhere, a key feature is the long term. Yeah. So take Bangladesh, Mauritius and other countries. You don't look at these things with a 5-year time horizon, 3-year time horizon, which is typical of traditional aid organizations, right? So you need at least a 25-year horizon. So that is the reason why trying to find development finance that has this kind of time horizon is absolutely essential. Whether it comes from domestic sources or from foreign sources, doesn't matter. And this is has been one of the big challenges for most African countries, is having some predictable, whether it's aid or not, doesn't matter, but predictable development finance, something that can say, okay, if I want to commit to, I don't know, a new network of industrial parks, if I want to commit to developing 3 new ports or a railway system, I need decades, not a few years. Who is going to provide this kind of finance? So this is where patient capital comes in. You need creditors that have the patience, the ability to actually assume a risk, that evidently comes in these settings, with a long-term view. A long-term view that says, okay, this will pay off, not in 5 years' time, in 30, 40 years' time. And that was the other reason why. And so, there have been some studies, like from people from the Boston Global Development Center, Gallagher and others, who documented Kaplan. They documented this notion of patient capital in much more detail. There's also another aspect to it, which is what has characterized the development of infrastructure in China itself. As you know, if there's one country where infrastructure development has been absolutely astonishing, it's China. And in China, one of the things, and economists like Justin Lin has stressed this many times, one of the features of those processes is this idea of building ahead of time. So, which is quite different from the typical sort of cost, narrow cost benefit analysis that agencies like the World Bank tend to follow. So imagine that you want to build a road, and that will start, is there enough traffic to support, the building of that road? Do we have like already traffic jams on the dirt tracks? So you need something already going on in order to justify a major infrastructure development. So building ahead of time basically turns this upside down and say, okay, we look at this place empty, nothing's happening, but the idea is that we have ambition that something will happen in 30 years' time. But for that ambition to materialize, we need something in place, some foundation. So in a sense, it's kind of the foundation type of argument of infrastructure. So build ahead of time. There's another advantage to that. Obviously, there's a risk because you might end up with a white elephant. Yes. But the other big advantage of building ahead of time, and therefore the need for patient capital, is that if you build now, costs are likely to be lower. So you end up with a lower cost infrastructure that will pay off, much later in time. But yeah,
But you need a crystal ball. Yeah.
yes, you need the development financiers, the creditors who believe in this.
Yeah.
If they don't believe in it, you're not going to get the money. Yeah.
But that another thing that you talk about is the political settlement, and it's not just the political settlement in the country. It is also the patient capitalist.
Of course.
The source of your finance. I mean, this is an old debate we've been having about developmental states and political settlements that are more and less conducive to rapid economic growth for a long time. And that long time horizon, of course, we don't really associate that with democratically elected governments, do we? So is there a link there as well to the settlement debates?
Absolutely. I mean, you can think of creditors who go to a country and say, well, is the policy framework in place credible in terms of its long-term horizon or not? And I think this is an absolutely valid question. And in a sense, Ethiopia is an interesting case because, before 2020, the political settlement was such that this kind of long-term horizon was taken for granted. Because everyone assumed, oh yeah, there's a strong developmental state there, but the foundations were rather fragile, and of course that 2020 onwards, the whole thing exploded, and suddenly I mean, some people kind of expected something like that to happen, but many others realized that, well, the political settlement wasn't as strong and as solid as we assumed. So that obviously can have an impact on those who are supposed to support these processes. So if they see suddenly that, look, the risk is even higher than we thought, and these sort of credible industrial strategies are too dependent on relatively fragile political settlements, which can collapse at any time, then maybe you think twice. So, is this one of the reasons why Chinese policy banks, for example, they're not withdrawing, but they're changing the way they're financing. They're looking for kind of less risky, smaller, smart projects, as they call them, away from these big outlays of finance. It might be a sort of part of the learning process of this.
Exactly. There's a lot of learning by doing in there, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Getting your hands dirty is how you do it. Very interesting. One other thing that I thought was very striking is the comparison of Angola and Ethiopia. And when I was reading at first, I was thinking, is this an example of the natural resource curse in some way? Angola being so resource rich and Ethiopia mainly being human resource rich. Does that partly explain the difference in the way they took up the opportunities that China's industrialization strategy offered?
Yes and
down that route.
no. Yes and no. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, you could say if the political settlement in Angola and the kind of leadership that was in place at the time when we were doing the research and so on was reflective of research curves in Angola, maybe. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that, in the sense, you do have resource-rich countries that have quite, different political settlements and any time. I think probably one of the biggest differences was that Angola was coming out of a long civil war in 2002. That's really when these, big Chinese credit lines came to the country. And one big difference is that Angola's political settlement was one with a very dominant regime. The other party had been defeated in the war. So in a sense, there was very limited threat to its stability and its legitimacy and so on. However, they did understand that they had to deliver development in a way that was as visible as possible. And rapid infrastructural development was the kind of trajectory they chose. And in a sense, you could argue, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The country was ravaged by the civil war. I mean, outside Luanda, infrastructure was completely dilapidated. So I wouldn't blame the Angolan elite for essentially focusing on, big projects, getting roads built, etc., without really having an a coherent industrial policy framework in place. Of course, those elites were also elites that were very interested in rapid enrichment, in making sure that they found different ways of capitalizing on new activities emerging and so on. So there were so many opportunities to accumulate wealth at that time that it's hard to, in a sense, to blame them. So I wouldn't say it is the research curves per se, it's just because they have oil, but it was a particular moment of the history of Angola that really led to this. And the fact that, yeah, having oil and the oil money meant that, they could pay for a lot of those imports rather than
Mm.
think, oh, should we replace these imports? But as I document in the book, say, even without a coherent industrial policy framework, the construction materials industry actually flourished, despite the lack of, despite the lack of policy. Why? Because, all these imports were flowed in the country, opportunities emerged, and as Hirschman used to say, oh, induced investment, investment demand. Entrepreneurs saw the opportunities. Why don't we um, produce cement? There's so
Yeah.
much demand. Cement is really expensive to import. Let's produce it. The same with steel and these other things. So that's one thing. That's Angola. Ethiopia, again, Ethiopia was quite different in the sense that although it had a strong regime, the political settlement was more fragile. Yeah.
Mm.
So the regime in power then, with Meles Zenawi, um, was very driven by the idea that they needed to deliver development in a broader sense, in the sense that they had to deliver development in the form of jobs. Yeah.
Food
Why?
security. Yeah.
Ethiopia is a much bigger country than Angola,
Yeah. Yeah.
millions and millions of people entering the labor market,
Mm.
young population, in a context that was potentially fragile, politically speaking. And it was fragile precisely because of the settlement that had been agreed in 1991 with, the so-called ethnic federalism,
Yeah.
which, in a sense, put the seed for identity politics, potentially.
Yeah.
So in order to combat the potential damage of identity politics, the idea is that we need to do something. We need to deliver something. And industrialization, structural transformation, is a critical pathway. Now, but that's not enough. This idea that there is this potential threat, so we need to do something about it. You also need people in power with ideas.
Yeah.
And that was another big difference that we observed, firsthand in both Ethiopia and Angola. The Ethiopian government had a critical mass of people in power who had clear ideas and also had the urge to materialize those ideas into something tangible. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a powerful imperative, wasn't there? Yeah.
Yeah.
To
But
deliver.
the ideas were there, the
Mm.
aspirations were there, and therefore they created the frameworks and the institutions that were conducive to, okay, how can we achieve industrialization in a
Mm.
country like Ethiopia? What is it that we need to do? So having these people in power with this kind of drive was absolutely essential.
Mm.
This kind of elite policy lead was missing in Angola.
But it's also when the difference between the contrast between Ethiopia and Angola also I think shows up in the labor regime and the kind of
Yeah,
working environments. I was
absolutely.
very struck by how strong the Ethiopian government had been on pushing for things, not a minimum wage, but
Yeah.
other labor regulations that were so, just absent elsewhere.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
see,
this is a very interesting part of the story, although, I mean, many people were critical of the Ethiopian government in the sense that, um, starting wages were far too low, and that created all kinds of
yeah.
work grievances, which then resulted in strikes and so on and so forth. So they didn't get everything right in terms of labor. In fact, this is probably was one of the weakest points
Mm.
in the industrial strategy. But one thing was quite clear is that, they bet on the power of industrial hubs
Mm-hmm.
to facilitate the acceleration of this industrial development. They also understood that they needed foreign investors, that local domestic capital wasn't really ready and there to invest in these ventures. And one thing they did think was, look, they went around the world, exploring failures as well as success. It wasn't just about, oh, let's look at China and Singapore, etc. It was also failed cases of where things didn't go that well. And I think that policy leadership had something in mind which was quite strong, which is we don't want. So if we, they quickly realized that attracting investment for textile and apparel was one of the best ways forward. Why? Because it was likely to be more labor intensive. They needed the jobs and more likely to generate foreign exchange. They needed the foreign exchange through exports. Okay. But then they knew that labor regimes in the textile and apparel industry are quite harsh. We know that especially from Asia.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to reproduce the kinds of mistakes of so many Asian success stories.
Yeah. Why are you going to build a new sweatshop?
Exactly. So there was a bit of a proactive obsession to avoid the sweatshop, which is why the approach was to develop, high quality industrial parks from the point of view of, for example, environmental standards, from the point of view of also workers' well-being within the factories, ventilation and things like that. So really state-of-the-art infrastructure. But they also thought the reason for doing that was precisely to showcase these to higher quality investors. This is something that I document in the book. It's something that our colleague Arkebe Okubai was very much behind that and has written about it. Is this idea that you can bring foreign capital, for these industrial strategy, but you have to be quite selective. You have to be very careful with what kind of foreign capital you want to bring. Don't bring cowboys.
Yeah.
Bring high quality suppliers who are used to very demanding global export markets, but also are used to compliance, to making sure that conditions are they're not sweatshop conditions.
Yeah,
and that was quite deliberate on the part of the Ethiopian government to avoid that sweatshop trap, which also meant, for example, that things like subcontracting to local suppliers was very tightly controlled. To avoid the kinds of things that you see, for example, in Bangladesh or with some companies, they are very tightly monitored, but then you have a whole ecosystem which is not really that tightly monitored, right?
Yeah.
So that was very deliberate, and that way it's true that meant that conditions were not as bad as you see in other places. But if you ask any Ethiopian workers, I would say, well, yeah, I mean, maybe they didn't have anything to compare. all they knew is like what wages I'm getting at the end of the month, and at the beginning they didn't understand why they were so low. So there were all kinds
of low wages and the discipline, the really long hours. It's very arduous, that kind of labor.
That's true. But interestingly, in the early stages, especially, that was one of the areas of resistance. Most Ethiopian workers didn't want to do the overtime. There was a continuous clash with company managers coming from Asian context where the overtime was the norm, and then suddenly they found these people, they don't want to work for more money. That's what the manager used to tell us. We don't understand. They don't want to do 2-3 more hours, pay even higher. They want to go home. So this is also one of the aspects of the book where I look at basically the process of building an industrial workforce is an uneven and quite protracted one, and it's not specific to a particular culture. I mean, some people used to tell us, "Oh, yeah, Ethiopians are like that." And I was like, "Well, I've read plenty of books about Thailand, Vietnam, even earlier than that, Hajun Chang's work on the lazy Japanese workers and whatnot." So these kinds of cultural stereotypes are quite common.
It's about work cultures, isn't
Absolutely.
It's not about national or ethnic cultures. Absolutely.
Yeah,
how you're socialized. I thought that was really fascinating part of it. But I'm going to ask you to finish with a little bit. You end with this quite major conclusion about the task of industrialization requiring a favorable political settlement, balance of power that's conducive to dynamic accumulation and investment directed towards manufacturing. And it's a deeply political problem.
Yeah.
And so you say, of course, you can't impose or engineer those conditions. You can't copy them from an existing model. So basically, don't start here, I think, is the key message. But you do actually say there are ways in which, if a government or a political entrepreneur or even a development partner from outside, somebody wants to help kickstart this process, there are policy messages. Tell us about those policy messages.
Yeah, I mean, that's indeed the end of the book. I didn't want to end with this excessive relativism where, you end up saying, oh, well, this model cannot be replicated, which is quite common in the literature. I mean, China is impossible to replicate. And it's true, China has such scale that it is pretty obvious that wouldn't be replicated in Ethiopia. but not in the way that happened. But you take Vietnam again. Vietnam is a country more or less the size of Ethiopia, and Vietnam has done a lot of things that actually also look a lot like China, but within their own particularities. So I think it's important to bear in mind that we have now enough historical records of past industrialization experiences, but also we have enough knowledge of the contemporary world and how global production networks work to at least have a sense of some of the critical ingredients to a successful industrialization process. And in the book, I highlight 5, basic things, starting from the most basic, more precondition-like to the ones that are more also desirable. So among preconditions, good education, fairly well-educated labor force. And that doesn't mean just schooling. Academic schooling is also about skills, it's about experience. I mean, to what extent a lot of the industrial workers in China were good, not because they were educated or literate, but also because they had previous experience in factories in the old Maoist periods in the 1960s and 70s. Those skills also matter. So these sort of work experiences also are part of the package. But anyway, good education, skills, plus the basics of energy and economic infrastructure. So having access to energy, reliable, stable energy and this is something that any industrial investor would tell you. Why did you come to Ethiopia? They didn't say, oh, because the wages are very low. No, the first thing they say is electricity costs are low and electricity is available and stable. The second thing is having enough capital to finance the kind of investment that is needed for industrialization. Okay, so the kinds of infrastructure that you need for industrialization, that needs finance. So you need that to solve that problem. Then there's capital. If you don't have a business sector, domestic capital that has the resources to invest in industries, then yes, you need to look at foreign capital, which means that FDI is again something you need to consider. And if you bring in FDI, then you really need to understand how to best manage FDI so that your goals are achieved rather than the goals of those investors alone. Third thing is state capabilities to and mechanisms and tools to make sure that the state is able to discipline that capital, whether it's domestic or foreign. That is not just a free lunch. And this is what Alice Amsden called, the reciprocal control mechanisms. The state gives you something, that gives you, I don't know, an industrial park with good infrastructure at really subsidized prices, maybe cheap credit, whatever. You have to give us something in return to meet some targets. And this is something actually is really difficult. And it's very political as well. So that's one thing. And not always the same reciprocal control mechanisms work in the same way in different countries. The fourth thing is obviously facilitate and accelerate this development of the industrial workforce while avoiding the low wage trap. That's very important. What it means is, yes, you want to create as many jobs as possible. You want to bring as many, especially young people, as possible into those jobs, but you need to make sure that you invest to increase productivity, because this is really then going to translate into higher wages rather than, compete at the bottom of the pile. And therefore that becomes a race to the bottom, which is something that you want to avoid. And last but not least, a stable macroeconomic environment. I mean, this is any development economist would tell you, if currency risk is low, that's good. Foreign, especially if you bring in foreign investors, they need low currency risk. They need to be able to get their dollars so that the operations are not disrupted. But equally, inflation. When you build in an industrial workforce, the one thing that really affects real wages, apart from nominal wages, of course, but it's inflation. This is exactly what was happening in Ethiopia the last 10 years, is that, nominal wages were increasing actually in the industrial sector. So nobody can say, oh, these guys just started with low wages and didn't move. But inflation was high. And, you need to catch up, otherwise, that's felt in the pockets of ordinary workers. So those 5 things are things that we've learned from the industrial experiences of early industrializers, late industrializers, late industrializers. So there's something right about them. Now, how do you achieve them? That's a different story. I mean, the political is central to all this. In the book, I talk about having ambition, what our colleagues call possibilism, a possibilist approach to things, which is if you don't have ambition, you're not going to achieve things. So elites, governments need to be ambitious, cautious, of course, realistic, whatever. But if they're not ambitious, forget it. And in fact, this is what's been missing in many African countries over the last 3 decades. It's a lack of ambition, or as Jude Moore, who used to be minister in Liberia and now works for CGD, he talks about the trap of outsourcing ambitions. And this has happened in so many countries. They've outsourced ambitions to the World Bank or to whatever bilateral donor was coming and say, oh, this is the kinds of things that you would need to do. This is the best policy framework for you. This is what you need to include in your policy reduction strategy, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so developing those ambitions is central, but also getting the policy learning and coordination right. That is incredibly difficult and really challenging. In the book, I talk at some point about the coordination, the articulation between different governance levels.
Of governance. Yeah, I was very struck by that. Yeah.
So Ethiopia is an interesting case because it's a federal state. So you have a strong federal component of the state. Then you have the regional governments and the local governments, quite different in the way they organized. And therefore, the articulation between these three different levels is absolutely crucial. Do they all work in the same direction? Do they all have the same kind of interest? Were they all, for example, equally committed to this industrialization drive? Probably not. And that was one of the issues in Ethiopia. So, some of the work that has been done, for example, Yuan Ang on China is precisely about that. How these different levels, the central to the provincial to the local county, were articulated, what she called directed improvisation. Why is that interesting? Because, there was direction, but it wasn't top down, right? So, again, this will vary across contexts. You don't have a strong communist party in all countries.
No.
As you say before, you have, liberal electoral democracies that bring this kind of instability into a place. It's sort of political marketplace that sometimes reduces the incentives to this kind of politics. But it's something that is absolutely, for industrialization at least, historically has always been central. Coordination, articulation between different governance levels, and policy learning. The fact that you will make mistakes, and the issue is not simply ignoring these mistakes or pretending that don't exist, but actually acknowledging them and say, okay, we got this wrong. Maybe we didn't have to pursue industrial hubs. Maybe we need to pursue something else, and being able to say, okay, let's try something else. Yeah. So that's, I think, the sort of, in summary, the final 3 pages of the book try to bring a policy blueprint. That shouldn't be blueprint, but
I think in particular this idea of the possibilism, the ambitions, the bringing, the nationalizing, if you like, the ideas and the ambitions, I think is a really good way to end this conversation. And the book is open access.
It is open access.
Anyone can read it.
Anyone can read it. You can download it as PDF, read it on the screen. Anyway, it's that was another important battle for this book. It's a short book. And, I want it to be read by as many people as possible.
Yeah, I think it will be. Thank you so much.
All right.